Good evening. This is the second of two NAFTA debates which we have scheduled. You went to the first one last night. I talked to Ross today, and there are no hard feelings. He's invited the Gores down for the weekend, but he said that Air Force Two has to land at the Alliance Airport. So they're trying to figure out whether or not they will do it. Tonight we have a distinguished panel which I will introduce to you in a moment. And each of the panelists will speak for 5 minutes. And after the panel is done, there may be a bit of interchange amongst the panelists, depending on how it goes. But of course, we're going to have an emphasis on also getting you all to have the opportunity to ask questions and to engage in this very, very important debate. So let me introduce the panelists and turn it over quickly to them. First is Professor Robert Lawrence from the Kennedy School. Second is Ron Blackwell from the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers. Third is Kurt Campbell from the White House on leave from the Kennedy School. Fourth is Tim Weiskell, who is the Director of the Environmental and Ethics Program at the Divinity School. And fifth is Ken Berlin, who's a practicing attorney in Washington and representing various environmental groups that are supporting NAFTA. So with that, Robert, let me give you your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Why do I believe that the NAFTA is good for the United States of America? Well, firstly, I think if you look at the various studies which have been done on the NAFTA, you get an overwhelming impression that the NAFTA will have small and positive effects on the United States in the long run, in the short run, but rather considerable benefits for the U.S. economy over the long run. Let me explain how I reach those conclusions. Firstly, why will the NAFTA have positive effects on the United States economy in the short run? Well, it's pretty straightforward. The tariffs that are currently protecting the Mexican market average roughly 10%. The tariffs that are paid on Mexican goods that come into the United States are far, far lower. Indeed, effectively, they're only around 2%. The nominal rates are 4%, but Mexicans get many concessions and tariff-free access. And so what happens when you remove those tariffs is that, in essence, you create more export opportunities for the United States than you do for Mexico. And so the impact effect is going to be positive on the U.S. But I don't believe that what trade is really all about is this net effect which so many people are arguing about about the short run. What trade is really about is allowing each economy to specialize and produce the things that it makes better. And therefore, it isn't going to be just the United States or just Mexico, but it's going to be all the partners in the NAFTA who are going to benefit from the result of specialization. Now, why do I think these effects are rather small? Indeed, I think one of the problems with the whole discussion is that it's essentially been hyped up. Mexico is a very small economy today. Its GNP is basically 4% the size of the United States. The result is that virtually anything that happens in Mexico is pretty small for the United States today. And that's why I think when you look at the numbers, in fact, of studies which claim that jobs are going to be lost and studies which claim that jobs are going to be gained, what I think should really be appreciated is the order of magnitude of the numbers. They're talking about 200,000 jobs one way or another. Just to give you some perspective on that figure, in this recovery, which many believe to be somewhat anemic, the U.S. economy creates 170,000 jobs a month. So we're talking about changes which will be implemented over a number of years, and their effects will be relatively small. That's the short run. But let's think about the longer run. Mexico has changed its economic policies. It's adopted liberalization policies, privatization policies, and it has opened its economy to the United States, to both U.S. investment and to U.S. products. And Mexico is a growing economy. Its population is today 85 million, and it is growing rapidly. Indeed, it is not inconceivable that one day out there in the long run, the Mexican economy could be half the size of the United States economy. So what I think the NAFTA is really about is making the current changes that have taken place in Mexico both credible and permanent, reorienting the Mexican economy towards the American economy, and indeed giving Americans entry to an economy which will one day be half the size of our own. And so I think we have to look at this as a short-run trade-off. I think there are positive effects in the short run, but the long run is far more important. President Salinas has taken revolutionary steps in Mexico to change the nature of his economy and his society. What the NAFTA is really about is making those changes both credible and permanent. And that's why I believe it's in the interests of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Ron?
Thank you. The Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, like every union in the United States and in Canada and some in Mexico, are opposed to the North American Free Trade Agreement because it would undermine living standards not just in the United States, but also in Canada and in Mexico. We're opposed to this agreement not because we're opposed to trade with Mexico or Canada. That, in fact, is inevitable. North American economy is being integrated, both with regard to trade, with regard to investment, and with regard, most importantly, to immigration. And these processes will continue with or without a North American Free Trade Agreement. The only question is whether it is good or bad for living standards, for freedom, for peace, for justice, and for environmental sustainability. Our problem with this agreement is not that we don't want to have an agreement with Mexico, because in fact the problems are now so bad and so desperate in so many ways on the Mexican border, in the tenements and sweatshops of New York City and Quebec, that we must change the rules that govern the integration process of North America. We have to have rules that make the outcomes of this integration process work, not just for the corporations in North America, but also for the people and the environment in North America. Our opposition to this particular agreement comes from the fact that it is both unbalanced and incomplete. It is scrupulous to a fault in taking care of the tender concerns of U.S. multinational corporations, and there is not a word in this agreement on human rights, on worker rights, on means for harmonizing standards, social, environmental, upwards as opposed to downwards. And unless and until we can have an agreement that has a social and environmental dimension, and not just a corporate dimension, there will be no agreement. It will not pass Congress. We will stop it next week. Now, I think it's important to understand this issue at three levels. One is economically and socially. And here it needs to be thought about, this agreement is not, as Bob just talked about it, just a trade agreement. More importantly than its trade aspects are its investment aspects. It's very protective of corporate rights. I noticed, for example, Chapter 17 of this agreement on intellectual property rights, the protection for the corporation's property and copyrights, patents, and things like that. This is not liberalizing, this is protection, and it's protection for corporations. But there's not a word in this agreement, as I just said, on human rights. We hoped that when President Clinton was elected, he recognized many of these problems, and he promised to do something about them. And one of those areas was enforceable worker rights, because the lack of worker rights of Mexican workers is undermining the rights of workers in this country. If I had more time, I could tell you about exactly how that happens. But worker rights, the right of workers to say what they feel and what they think, to speak out, to freely associate with other workers, to organize unions if they want to take collective action in dealing with their employers. These rights were specifically excluded from the enforcement mechanism in these side agreements. What we need to ask for the Clinton administration is why? Why are the rights of corporations so important? Why are the rights of workers so dispensable? Unless and until there are human rights in these agreements, unless and until there are mechanisms to harmonize labor, social, environmental standards upwards, until there are resources available for dealing with the workers, the businesses, and the communities who will be adversely affected by this to help them to adjust to a changing world, we will oppose it. And unless and until we can do something about the untold human misery of Mexicans living in the United States, in caves in California, and in tenements in New York, we will oppose this agreement. All we want is an agreement that will ensure a just and a sustainable future for the people and the environment of North America. We hope that we can defeat this. We hope by defeating it we can convince the business community that they need to address these questions sincerely, and that therefore they'll begin a negotiation process. And when they start to renegotiate, it won't just be corporate lawyers at the table. It will be representatives of working people. It will be the environmental community. It will be the human rights community that bring their concerns to this kind of negotiation. And unless and until that happens, we cannot have what we want most of all, a just and a sustainable future for all North Americans.
Thank you. Barry?
Thank you. Last week in Washington, we brought together a group of supporters of the NAFTA from around the country, from both political parties, from Democrats and Republicans. Most of the major environmental groups were represented. Every living Nobel economist was there, every former Secretary of State, several former presidents, every former Secretary of the Treasury, every former American U.S. trade representative, prominent business people, a wide variety of folks. Tip O'Neill was there, actually, a good friend of labor, a good friend of Massachusetts. And he said in one of his remarks, he said, you know, our task before us is to try to make the private vote the public one. And what he meant by that is that he said if we had a secret ballot on NAFTA, the NAFTA would win in the House of Representatives by between 50 and 100 votes. And our task is to try to find the profile and courage among all the House members to see it in themselves to cast that vote of conscience. Now, one thing I want to tell you about that event last week, when you bring that kind of caliber of people together, it's shocking how big their egos are, first of all, but it's also surprising they agree on absolutely nothing, nothing except the interest in the United States in NAFTA. Now, Bob Lawrence has very eloquently described some of the domestic and economic considerations associated with this critical treaty. Let me just take a couple of minutes to talk about the foreign policy perspective and what's at stake for our country internationally. It's part of the debate that we haven't heard as much about, but I think it's critical for Americans to understand as we go forward. Now, we've heard a picture of Mexico that sounds a little bit like Stalin's Russia, but anyone who's spent any time in Mexico or Latin America in the past several years understands that there is a revolution taking place down there. And it is a revolution that has been inspired by us in the United States. It's a revolution of democracy, it's a revolution of market opening, and it's a revolution of working people. For the first time in generations, we have leaders in Mexico and throughout Latin America who want to trade with us and who want to work with us. If you wanted to be elected, if you wanted to be in political power in Mexico for generations, you ran against the Yankee of the North. President Salinas, who is a courageous man, when you ask Americans, where has there been courageous political change over the last 5 years? They are likely to say, well, in Poland or in Eastern Europe or in the former Soviet Union. That's all true. But frankly, we have to look in our own backyards because some of the real courageous economic and political reformers have been in our own backyard. And these are people that want to work closely with us, that want a partnership together as we go forward. Henry Kissinger last week. Now, you'll note, of course, that we're Democrats in the White House, but we are working hand in glove in a bipartisan manner to see NAFTA through. Henry Kissinger, in that familiar, deep Germanic twang last week, said that Americans, once in a generation, are offered a historic opportunity. 40 years ago, it was the creation of NATO and GATT and the Marshall Plan. Today, it is NAFTA. And he said, you know, when you look back in history, if you look back over the last 40 years, you can't even imagine the world without NATO or the Marshall Plan or other aspects of the Atlantic Alliance. But frankly, each of these decisions were mired in domestic debate. Each of these decisions required political courage, both on Capitol Hill and in the presidency. NAFTA is like this decision. Henry Kissinger said, and others seconded him, that in 10 years from now, as we weave our continent together in peace and prosperity, we will not be able to imagine a situation where we did not live in peace, in harmony, and in trade with Mexico. Let me just point out that as we go forward today, we have more institutional contacts with Spain and Portugal than we do with our closest allies, Mexico. We need to devote the remainder of this century working with our neighbors to make sure that we have hemispheric prosperity. And that leads to a second issue, and something that we have to keep critically in mind. Let's remember that this hemisphere prefers American products. They want to buy American things. They prefer American cars. They prefer American products. If we say no to NAFTA, I assure you they will look elsewhere. And just as we've tried to pry into other markets in Asia and in Europe, these people want our things. Let's give them the opportunity to trade with us. Let's not say no to them, because we have to understand there will be consequences. It's not as if we can just go back to the drawing board. Mexico has seen prosperity and peace. Let's engage them. Let's remember that we can't always go back to the drawing board and start over. There will be consequences in Mexico and Canada if NAFTA is not seen through. We're optimistic, and we think it's going to be voted yes next Wednesday. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ken? Thank you. How many of you brought along your copies of NAFTA tonight? Nobody? It's 2,000 pages. You might be forgiven. It's a little heavy to lug around. But what about the side agreements? How many brought those along? Anybody read the side agreements? 1, 2, 3. You guys don't count. 4, 5, 6. Okay. Well, that's encouraging. Well, you may recall these were made public on the 13th of September. And within 2 months and 4 days, your representatives are supposed to make a reasoned judgment on what they feel their constituents feel about this. Of course, there's no real barrier to getting these documents. They are, in fact, publications of the United States government. And if you call a number, which I'll be happy to give you here afterwards, you can order one and put it on your Visa card. You'll be told at the time that it'll take about 6 weeks to deliver. Now, this means that if you are fast off the blocks on the 13th of September, when the side accords, which are commentary on the 2,000-page document, were made available, you could have gotten everything that you needed to look at these materials. And you had about a 2-week window, because it takes 6 weeks for delivery, so you had about 2 weeks to get it all together. Then you could have read the 2,000 pages of speed readers at Harvard. You guys are smart. Take it in. There's another way to do it, of course. You can get it online. And most of you probably have downloaded the portions of it that interest you. It only takes about $2,000 worth of hardware and a couple of years of training and a little familiarity with internet and the like. They're freely available. I don't know why you didn't all bring them along tonight. But in any case, if you have not studied them in detail, you don't need to worry, because the experts, as Kurt has just said, have already told you what's in them. If you've missed this, I feel sorry for you, but it must be because you don't read the newspapers. As he indicated, they had a little conference last week, and the New York Times, of course, dutifully reports these things in the news, but also carries ads for you about this. We have 300 economists, 136 newspaper editors, and 6 presidents support NAFTA, including Jimmy Carter, of course, who is dutifully hauled out every once in a while to say something about this. It is of interest that Jimmy Carter's labor secretary, in fact, called this agreement not a free trade agreement, but an investment protection agreement. His labor secretary. And in fact, that's what it is. It's a free investment agreement, not a free trade agreement. The reason, though, why environmentalists are nervous about this, and why, at least if you read the newspapers, you know that the environmental community is split down the middle on this, is that it's a lousy deal. It's a lousy deal for the environment. It's a lousy deal for the North American environment, not just the United States environment. You may have wondered whether Canada sort of fell off the map in the previous presentations. Not a single word was mentioned, either about Canadian reactions, which were clearly illustrated in the latest election, or about their grievances to the free trade agreement, which is already in place, either in terms of loss of jobs or in terms of its environmental impact in Canada, mainly the rapid resource drawdown which it facilitates. Those of us in the United States who are concerned about larger ecological issues in the hemisphere and in the globe are vitally concerned about this agreement because it is precisely what Kurt called it, a very important agreement. It's a watershed. It's a point of no return. Ask yourself very quickly, run it through as a scenario. There are roughly 15 million corn growers on little peasant farms in Mexico. They're paid a supported price at this point for corn that they grow. Cargill
You have 15 seconds.
has enormous storehouses of surpluses, which are going to be shipped south of the border with new trucking agreements faster than you can calculate it. It's going to displace a lot of people. They're going to move to Mexico City or up over the border. It's going to unleash levels of soil erosion and social unrest that we have not yet calculated. This is not a debate about whether we want better relations with Mexico. This is a debate about whether this treaty will engender better relations with Mexico. Those who say we can't do any better are selling their own staff short. Clever people like Kurt, who work at the White House, can do a lot better. Thanks.
Thank you. Ken?
Thank you. Well, I've read the side agreement, and I'm here today to tell you, if you'd like, exactly what it says, exactly what it does, and exactly what it doesn't do. I can't do all that in 5 minutes, so I welcome questions from the audience. But most of the environmental community, groups representing most of the environmental community, strongly support the environmental side agreements. They were intimately involved in the negotiation of the side agreement, both the pro and the anti groups. They've been involved in it since the very beginning of this year. The draft they did of the side agreement ultimately became the negotiating document the U.S. government used in its negotiation. And let me start by trying to explain what they were looking at and what they thought they could do in this environmental side agreement. Above all, they were looking at a status quo in Mexico on the environment that was totally unacceptable. There's heavy pollution, there's natural resource destruction going on, there's problems with enforcing laws, there's tremendous problems on the border between the United States and Mexico. Current Mexican administration was making progress on this, but it was only a start, and they needed support on it. So what the environmental groups were trying to do in this agreement, above all else, was change the status quo. Because if things continued the way they were continuing, the environment in Mexico had no chance of producing the kind of lifestyle that I think people here would like to see everybody have, and it would have done do terrible damage to the environment. So looking at this, people said, can we do something that changes the status quo? We have to change it, and we have to change it now. Not 5 years from now when this agreement is, when people try and renegotiate an agreement, not 10 years from now. There's no reason to believe a renegotiation of an agreement like this would take less than an indefinite period of time. Now, in addition to changing the status quo, how do you do it? One way you do it is you try and make environmental issues in Mexico, the United States, and Canada continent-wide environmental issues. Prior to NAFTA and without NAFTA, we have no legitimacy in the United States to complain to Mexico about environmental problems. We can't go down there and say your laws are inadequate, or you should clean up pollution, or you should not cut down tropical forests. We have no institutional way of speaking to the Mexicans and at least negotiating with them on what to do about this problem. With NAFTA, we do have that. We've now set up a commission that's going to look at problems on a continent-wide basis. The United States has an interest in Mexico, and they have a legitimate interest because trade does affect the environment. And the whole purpose of this side agreement and the negotiations took place was to put in place mechanisms that alleviated and took away the negative impacts of trade and pushed Mexico in a direction that benefited the environment. So again, everything you can hear about the Mexican environment being bad is probably true. None of the groups that support NAFTA deny that. But what they're looking for is a solution. And the problems exist with or without NAFTA. And the question is, does NAFTA help? And NAFTA does help. Because if you take a look at the kind of problems that a trade agreement creates, the side agreements and NAFTA are designed to address each of those, and they address them at least reasonably well. They're not perfect, but they address them well. What are these kinds of problems? Well, one problem, of course, is that the trade changes patterns of development. It causes development to take place and industrialization to take place in Mexico that might not take place without a trade agreement. What that means, first of all, is it may take place in areas where there's an adequate infrastructure. You may have a new plant, even if it has the best pollution control equipment in the world, there's no place to put hazardous waste. It doesn't do you any good to have good environmental laws or to have good pollution control equipment in a facility, because most industrial facilities will produce waste. One thing NAFTA does is it has drawn out approximately $8 billion that will be available for infrastructure spending, mostly on the border where it's desperately needed. This is an incredible amount of money if you look at the budget situation in Washington today. Opponents of NAFTA say, well, it'll take $20 billion. Supporters say, we'll take the $8 billion, and when we finish spending it, we're going to ask for another $12 billion, and we're going to be back asking for it. So we want to start with that $8 billion. A second problem is inadequate laws in Mexico, inadequate environmental laws, or failure to enforce the law in Mexico. Actually, to a large extent, Mexican environmental laws are probably adequate. They're not enforced well, though. That has all kinds of implications. It not only creates pollution, but it also potentially encourages U.S. businesses to move down there to a place where there is inadequate laws or inadequate enforcement of laws. The NAFTA addresses that, and the side agreement addressed that directly on this Commission on Environmental Cooperation. Commission has the right to hear complaints from citizens, to investigate those complaints, to propose action plans to solve the problems, and to impose penalties and sanctions if that doesn't work. Now, there's a lot of dispute about how effective this procedure will be, and I'm happy to discuss that in great detail.
You have 15 seconds.
Okay, we believe that it will, not in 15 seconds, so you'll have to ask me questions, but I have no doubt that it will improve environmental enforcement in Mexico. It won't solve all the problems, but it will improve environmental enforcement. By the time I go through more, one last issue, though, is trade agreements do, of course, create the potential of adversely affecting the laws of the country with the stronger agreement, because trade agreements do set standards against which a country's laws have to be measured. And if those standards are too high, the laws of a country can be thrown out, and things that we all want on the environment can be defeated. Again, it would take a lot of time to explain the details, but NAFTA doesn't do that. The NAFTA standards are better and more protective of the environment than the standards that exist now under the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades. They're better provisions. We haven't had the kind of problems people are talking about in GATT. I can tell you exactly why these are better provisions if we have time, and I welcome your questions on that. But on bottom, this agreement changes the status quo. It provides a way of looking at the North American environment on an overall basis. It has great potential to be a very exciting development, and it's a unique development in trade. It's a first step, but it's a very important one. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask one question of the panel. We've heard about environmental concerns, we've heard about economic concerns, we've heard about human justice concerns, international concerns, among others. Must we choose among these various values whether or not we pick NAFTA, or is there some way that we can fashion this agreement, or perhaps it is fashioned so that we can move forward on all of these values at one time? Anyone like to comment?
When this NAFTA was first proposed a couple of years ago, workers, farmers, and environmentalists from Mexico, Canada, the United States came together in Congress. We held a forum and we said, look, your negotiating agenda is too narrow. We have concerns too. We would like to open up the debate. Back then we were told, well, these are all important concerns, but they have nothing to do with trade. This is a trade agreement. That was the position that was taken. We've worked since then to build coalitions of this kind, all three countries, and to work between our countries. But we've gotten to the point where we have actually a parallel agenda for how these things might be dealt with. And we have convinced in our political space in the United States the politicians that they must somehow address these issues, hence the side agreements. But we have not gotten the government or the business community or the academic elite of this country to a point where they're dealing with these questions sincerely. They only want to make a show of dealing with these things in order to get the bill through Congress. We're not quite there yet. We've made enormous progress, and I consider this a success. We have many ideas that come from peasants in Mexico and from environmentalists in Canada about what the shape of an acceptable agreement would be. But we haven't gotten the space in the United States to get an agreement that would take these issues seriously. But the issues, the alternatives are out there, and if we can only go this last mile and force a renegotiation of this treaty and bring the people that have these kind of concerns to the table, I think we have an obvious way to combine many of these values.
Robert?
Well, I think I understand the logic of why one might be concerned about certain workers in the United States in competition with Mexico. But what I find perplexing is to understand how we could be arguing that this is an agreement which is genuinely bad for Mexican workers. And indeed, how we could actually envisage that this agreement and the growth it's going to bring is somehow going to lead to more Mexicans coming to the United States rather than fewer. Now, I would acknowledge that there is a particular problem in corn, and that has to do, in my judgment, far more with the fact that the ejido system is being reformed in Mexico, and that could displace some farm workers, and it's a reason why the agreement goes slow on the liberalization of corn. But in general, why do Mexicans come to the United States? They come because their wages are low in Mexico. And what will stem that tide? What will stop them from coming under desperate conditions to seek work in the United States? Economic development in Mexico. What does the NAFTA do? It makes progress on that score. What will make Mexico a cleaner country? Do you think they deliberately want the environment that they have? No, they're being forced to choose between an environment and industry. Now, we know that's a critical choice which all developing countries face, and we know that with economic development, countries then choose to spend more on public goods of all types, including the economic environment. So the best contribution you can really make to improving the environment in Mexico, to changing the standards and provisions that they give to workers in Mexico, is allowing them to trade and to grow.
Tim?
Well, I guess the major thrust of the environmentalist critique has not been understood. All we get back in return is a kind of more is better, growth is good. More is better, growth is good. More is better, growth is good. You might as well add another phrase to it. More is better, growth is good. We thank petrol for this food. And make it into a table grace. Teach it to your kids. It's fine. What is this agreement going to do by way of addressing the overall consumptive patterns of the United States and Mexico and Canada? Look at the way most of this trade will take place. It'll be goods that are partially assembled here, being transported down to Mexico to be fully installed into various other things, and then transported back to the United States. What's the petrol cost of production of units after this deal goes through? I can tell you it will increase, not decrease. At a time when environmentalists are trying to lower the petrol consumption of goods, this does exactly the opposite. You can do it for corn. You can do it for any of the soybean products. You can do it for any of the industrial products. This will increase the ecological impact of production, whether it's down there or here. In general, in North America, it's an ecological bad. Selling more goods does not solve the ecological problem. It aggravates it. The notion that people make money off of this and that might spend eventually, as it trickles down, a little bit more on cleaning up after themselves is the silliest argument ever put forward in the public forum.
Ken?
I certainly agree that economic growth in Mexico and even increasing prosperity doesn't guarantee protection of the environment. There are examples of developing countries, I think Taiwan more than developing, where there's very poor environmental protection despite a great deal of prosperity. But I do think that without economic growth, you will never get protection of the environment. So the question for us in this became, how do we make sure that this economic growth is channeled in a way that doesn't harm the environment, that you can take advantage of the economic growth and protect the environment at the same time. And again, that's what these side agreements try to do, and we think they make good progress in doing that. It's not perfect. Controlling that factor is, of course, incredibly difficult, and it's incredibly difficult in the United States, let alone in Mexico. I'm certainly not happy where I live with how we control land development, for example. But going back to the ecological effect in Mexico, again, I have to go back to the status quo. If you've traveled extensively in rural Mexico, as I have, I've traveled extensively in tropical forests throughout Central and South America, I think you'd have to draw the conclusion, if you know that without change, these forests are not going to survive. The endemic species, the birds that I go look for, because I'm a very active bird watcher, are simply not going to survive unless something is done to change the patterns that have existed to date in Mexico. And again, I think NAFTA gives us the potential to do that. It gives us the potential to look at this issue in a way that we can contribute to that, and again, at least alleviate some of the impact. Not easy to deal with. It's very, very hard to stop cutting a forest anywhere in the world, but this agreement will give us as good a chance as we're going to have in the United States, anywhere in the developing world, to alleviate those kind of impacts. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to the audience if there are questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Alfonso Nava, and I'm from Los Angeles. I just want to say that in Mexico there's a saying that says, del dicho al hecho hay mucho trecho. So what that means simply is that there's a lot of academic rhetoric floating around, but until I see it in my pocket, I'm going to wonder what's going on, because I do applaud the president for having the courage to take on a very difficult task. I've been in Mexico 30 years in the area of Baja and in Mexico City, and I can tell you that there's very limited democracy in the country. And I believe that when I read in the Wall Street Journal where you have $500 million agreements being drawn up by Flor Daniel out of Orange County, $1 billion agreements being drawn up by the Braun Industry, Santa Fe International, to build a water desalination plant in Baja.
Do you have a question, sir?
Power plant, yes, sir. But I guess my question is, how come there's no one of color, a person of Mexican descent in the panel? We have a lot of experts in this area, and I thought, why weren't they invited? Thank you.
In fact, we're invited, and indeed did attend dinner we had beforehand. A rather noted Mexican poet who is organizer and leader of a group called the Group of 100 Writers and Poets, a fellow named Homero Arichis was here earlier this evening talking with students on this. We did invite him to be part of the panel. He had a previous commitment, but in addition, he then indicated to us that it was rather risky to appear in a public place in the United States and oppose NAFTA. He indicated that there are real costs for that. There's a blacklisting procedure for people who do this, and it was a rather discouraging revelation. That is, we all wanted to ask him more questions, and he said, I'm sorry, this makes me far too vulnerable back in my own country.
Just a point on this. It is true that Mexico is not a full democracy. If you look at the pattern of progress, however, over the last several years, opponents and supporters of NAFTA will agree that they are heading in the right direction. Now, the question that we have to ask is, if we say no to NAFTA, do we have as much leverage to be able to impact their domestic politics as we would with NAFTA? And a second point about fear in the eyes of people who might come out against or for NAFTA. I will tell you that we heard earlier today that the labor unions are completely in alliance against NAFTA. I will tell you very honestly that that is not the case. And I have seen fear in the eyes of workers in our own country who would like to come out in favor, in support of NAFTA. We've had workers and union workers to the White House who have come out in favor of NAFTA, and they are frightened. Democracy can improve in Mexico and at home.
Yes, sir.
My name's Nod. I'm a student here, and I brought my side agreements.
Oh, great.
And I have a question for, I'm worried about the environment. I think the economic side is easy for me to understand. I have a question for Mr. Weiskel and Mr. Berlin. Maybe you can tell me what I'm missing here. I'm going to read you something from the side agreement. It says, sanctions and remedies provided for a violation of a party's environmental laws and regulations shall, as appropriate, include compliance agreements, fines, imprisonment, injunctions, the closure of facilities, and the cost of containing or cleaning up pollution. What is it I'm missing here? Why is it that NAFTA is going to hurt the environment? And this seems to me like some real teeth, that this is a real way to, for the whole North American continent to get into this environmental thing. What am I missing?
Well, of course, I don't think you're missing anything, so maybe Tim should answer the question.
Well, it's not so much what you're missing, it's what the side agreements are missing. That is the key. You just read what can be imposed if all the fine print before it is enacted, right? Now ask yourself, first of all, what the time lags involved in enacting all of that are. I mean, work through the agreements, the appeal processes, the entire delay that can go on before any activity can even be proposed as a sanction. The key verb in what you read is may be imposed. Not will be imposed, not must be imposed, may be imposed. Now, it seems to me that a clever person from the Kennedy School, if he wants to write loopholes in anything, would study that language very closely, because it's one great big loophole. You can drive Mack trucks through it. In addition, ask yourself what it doesn't address. That is, the whole grievance procedure is just that. It works on the basis of somebody doing something wrong and then someone complaining, right? Who's out there to protect groundwater? Who's out there to protect soil erosion? This is something that happens pervasively, gradually, barely able to mention. But if you rip 15 million people off of their land and drive them into cities and force the competition on the price of corn down to a level where people are overtaxing hillsides and cropping things continuously throughout the year, you can bet you're going to accelerate a rate of ecological degradation that we've never seen before in North America. The problem with doing that is that no one's going to object. They're not good. This peasant isn't going to go to the International Commission or try to address his own government's Environmental Protection Agency. He certainly is not going to have the equipment to take it through a grievance procedure of 5 levels of appeal. Do you think in any way the grievance procedure for pollution control starts to address the generalized circumstance of resource degradation encouraged by accelerated trade?
Actually, just one quick point. Actually, the provision that you read, which I believe is in Article 6, is a provision that it is not the sanctions provision under the Commission on Environmental Cooperation. What that provision is a provision that says each party has to open up its legal proceedings to its own citizens so that they can seek remedies to deal with environmental problems in their countries. And those remedies include the remedies that this gentleman just read out there.
They include.
So this agreement does 2 different things. They have to open the procedures. So what this agreement does is 2 things. One is it opens up things internally in the countries. That's incredibly important in Mexico. If Mexicans don't do it, it's a violation of the agreement. It's going to take a lot of work by Mexicans to do that effectively without question, but that's one thing. The second part of the agreement is that if that doesn't work, if a country doesn't enforce its laws, then the international community can come in, the North American community can come in and seek sanctions and penalties. And I won't get into that now, but the stuff Tim was talking about is a totally different provision. If we have another question, I'll talk about that.
Over here,
Thank you.
please.
Thank you. Mr. White, my name is Mrs. Ayer, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. And I'd like to ask or say that I'm really saddened that there is not a single woman not a single person of color, not a single Asian that you could find that would speak either for NAFTA or against it. So I'd like to ask you, when you solicited a diverse panel, what problems did you run into that made you unable to reach the goal of diversity that's, at the Kennedy School? Now, this is not an irrelevant question, because how, after 30 years after the passage of the civil rights legislation, nearly 30 years, if you cannot have a diverse panel, how are you going to guarantee civil rights in Sotillo, Juarez, or Tamazunchale, Mexico?
Let me just say, because we're as concerned about this issue as you are, and we put this panel together late. We had a number of people whom we tried to get whom we couldn't get, and we decided that we were better off going on with the panel, given the timeliness of the panel, even though we had missed our diversity goal and missed it badly in this case because of the timeliness of the issue. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Alan Eisenberg. I'm a second-year student here. My question is largely for Tim Weiskell and Mr. Berlin. I'll concede that consumption patterns might need to be changed here with regard to the environment. I have essentially a twofold question. The first is, there's a kind of a precursor here to the North American Free Trade Agreement, that is the Canadian-American Free Trade Agreement. What have been the environmental effects from that? I'm interested in hearing your perspective on that. And the second is, with regard to enforcement, you were just talking about who will protect the groundwater, things that are, say, public good in nature. As far as Mexico goes, won't trade bring in some kind of revenue so that they can then enforce some of their strict environmental laws?
Yeah, as far as the Canadian-U.S. agreement goes, there, of course, is no side agreement in that. One real difference between this agreement and the U.S.-Canadian agreement is that this is an agreement between a developed country and a much less developed country, with a very different system of laws, very different environmental problems, and it raises a whole new set of issues. In a way, it's unique for a trade agreement. It's the first agreement like this that really raises this kind of issue. So here we needed a new set of agreements on the environmental side, which I think work well, on the labor side, which are a different set of issues. So that's, I think, the first thing. I don't think you can really judge that very, very effectively. Tim, why don't you again respond to his more positive outlook on the agreement than you have?
Right. Well, the first question was, what do the Canadians think of this? This is something I think we ought to hear more about in the States, what the Canadians think about it. The Premier of Ontario, as you may know, took the Canadian government to court to sue them about the agreement. He happened to be a roommate of mine at Oxford, and we know each other pretty well, Bobby Ray. But we were just across the town from Bill Clinton at the same time. We were both sort of suffering through the British Academe at the same point. But we took very different routes. Bill Clinton studied politics. I studied British Empire and Commonwealth history. Now, the reason that this is relevant is that this free trade debate already took place 100 years ago over free trade imperialism in the British Empire. This is something Bill didn't learn because he went to the other set of classes. The reason why it's important in reference to the question you asked second, will they spend more money if they get more trade and more economic activity? The answer, of course, is yes, they will spend more money on the environment. The question is not will more money be spent on the environment or protecting it, but will it be spent at anywhere near the rate at which it's being degraded? In other words, is this a net gain or a loss? Not is it an absolute gain or loss? And I don't think you can even find an economist who will argue that it's going to be an absolute gain, a net gain in terms of spending more per unit of economic production. I mean, even economists acknowledge that what you've got is a dribble compared to a flood.
Well, have any studies been done on something like that, or on the Canadian type of agreement? You just were talking about yourself being a roommate of someone. I'm asking you whether there's actually been, do you know of any kind of effects of sort?
Yeah, well, as I was trying to allude to in British Empire Commonwealth history, there is a great deal of study on the history of liberalized trade agreements and what happens in their wake. What systematically happens in the wake of liberalized trade agreements, whether it's the scramble for Africa in, the 19th century. Basically, in 1885, the Europeans got together and decided to liberalize trade with Africa. What happens within a 15-year period after any liberalized trade agreement is an accelerated rate of natural resource drawdown that can never be reversed. I don't mean never in ecological time. Topsoil forms at the rate of about an inch every 10,000 years. It'll come back eventually. But in terms of human time frames, it's gone. It's non-renewable. And what we're going to see south of the border, and I'm afraid let's not focus too extraordinarily south of the border, what agricultural production techniques are going to be used in the United States to provide the grain to ship to Mexico? You think there's going to be the family farm that sees an enormous resurgence in this process? No. It's going to be the companies that control the transport. Who's that? Cargill International, the worst polluters of groundwater in the American Midwest.
The exciting thing about this agreement, though, is this, again, is the first trade agreement that tries to impose some sort of a regulatory structure on free trade. This is the first agreement that takes a look at something like the negative impacts on the environment from free trade and says, as an international community, or three nations in this case, we're going to do something about that.
Right. I agree with Ken on this. This is very important. It is an important first step. Question is it a big enough first step?
Again, yes, go ahead.
Well, firstly, there are very good studies which have actually looked at the relationship between economic growth and the environment. And it's clear it's a kind of an N-shaped relationship. And indeed, at something like a real purchasing power parity level of about $5,000 a head, you start to see that turning point. It so happens that that's exactly where the Mexican economy is today. And so that's why I argue, based on the very compelling work of Grossman and Kruger at Princeton University, who examined environmental air quality conditions in 80-something odd cities and examined this relationship, they found, in fact, that here we have an economy which is at that turning point. And indeed, if you listen to the debate in Mexico, you can see that they're at that turning point today. I'm not saying it will happen automatically, but a more fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves here is, do we want trade only with countries who are identical to us? Or are we prepared to accept international commerce with countries that meet certain norms, in our view, but are not identical with us? Because if harmonization is required as a precondition for trade, we won't have any trade. We'll only trade within the United States. It's clear to me that many Canadians find that American standards are simply not acceptable to them. But the question really is more fundamental then. I think those who counsel and argue that we cannot have trade unless we have harmonization are basically suggesting that we should have closed economies. I suggest to you that what we have to do is to accept the fact that ultimately we're living in a world of sovereign nations, each of which would like democratically to determine its own norms and standards, and that within this community we will have some minimum norms, but nonetheless we will also allow diversity. Because if we are going to prescribe to others and say, no, we won't trade with you unless you're just like us, we stifle one of the most important sources of economic progress, namely international trade.
I think we may be getting close to the real heart of this problem, and that is that no one is arguing about not trading or about not trading with different countries. The question is, how do you regulate that trade and investment and immigration? I think the difficulty here is that the economy of the world, not just of this part of the world, but of the world, is increasingly international. Corporations move capital around the world like crazy. People are moving all over the place. Trade is growing, and that's not going to stop. The problem, however, is that the regulatory structures for the economy remain national, or state, or provincial, or local. And these regulatory structures that were set up, in the case of the United States, when it was a relatively closed economy, in response to the Great Depression and after the Second World War, in the face of an increasingly global economy, become increasingly dysfunctional, and they don't work. They don't serve the purpose that they were set up to serve. So the question is not whether we trade or not. It's a question of how we regulate that trade. We need some mechanism to assure that markets simply don't produce misery. That's all we need. Now, we did this when we came out of the New Deal was about that. It's arguable that FDR saved capitalism from the capitalists. I think we need to do it again. We need to find mechanisms. Now, I really take strong exception to this idea that harmonization means you only trade with people your own kind. Harmonization recognizes the difference. In Europe, it's predicated on that difference. It just simply wants to make sure that when they harmonize, as they inevitably will do as integration proceeds, they harmonize at a higher rather than a lower level. And that's all we're trying to accomplish here. And there are very many very concrete things that can be done that there is an agreement about, but even between the labor movement and the business community in the United States, that simply are missing from this agreement. What we're trying to do here is historically unprecedented. It is an order of difficulty qualitatively greater than that of Europe. And yet Europe took a great deal more time. They put a great deal more money in it. They took these questions of harmonization and enforcement seriously, and we could well learn from their experience.
One comment, and then we're going to move on because all the panelists will have commented, and I want to get some more questions from
I would just differ with one point with my colleague on the panel. I would argue that FDR did not save capitalism for capitalists. I believe FDR saved the country from protectionism. The vote today, its historical analogy, almost precisely, is the vote in 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Act, which attempted, well-meaning, many would argue, legislators trying to protect jobs at risk in the United States by raising barriers, by cutting off trade, internationally, regionally. What followed was a decade of depression, misery. Many economists and political scientists would argue ultimately world war. Our view is that this is a similar historic moment where we have to make a decision while the world's walls are coming down. I mean, it is somewhat ironic that as we've torn down this wall in Eastern Europe, the Berlin Wall, that we are considering raising walls ourselves at the same time they're coming down elsewhere.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, my question is directed towards Mr. Berlin. You mentioned earlier that the side agreements had something set up where the citizens of, I take it, Canada, the United States, and Mexico could voice their opinion on, you mentioned such issues as the environment. But my question is what is at stake for these, committees that, will be, the people will be able to speak to or write to, whatever. I mean, is there jobs at stake? Whereas we have our congressman, right, who we write to, and his job is on the line if he doesn't, come to the people's, point of view on an agreement or anything that's going on south of the border, north of the border, or whatever the case may be. I don't just mean this as environmentally speaking. I mean it in all aspects. I think it's a great problem that isn't even being addressed. The people of the United States have no voice in any saying whatsoever in the NAFTA agreement once it goes through.
I guess there are a couple of things. I'll speak from the environmental side. I mean, basically, NAFTA requires more Mexico than the United States to open up a lot of its administrative proceedings. And again, it makes it a violation of the agreement if they don't. The example I was talking about on the environmental side is if you believe that there's a facility in your area or that you care about that's not complying with law, you can actually file a complaint with this Commission on Environmental Cooperation. And they have to respond to your complaint and make a decision whether to investigate and look at it. So what it really does, it adds a new layer of protection and a new source of pressure, really, on countries to deal with their environmental laws. Again, I don't think it's going to have a very big impact on the United States. I think it's going to have a much bigger impact, in all likelihood, down in Mexico, although I would expect in the United States to see quite a few complaints filed under this against U.S. companies for not complying with laws. Certainly, U.S. environmental groups complain all the time about enforcement or lack of enforcement by the U.S. government on environmental laws also. So I'm only dealing with a small part of that. I can't answer on the labor side.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Paul Johnson, and my question is for Mr. Campbell. You said that Mexicans love American goods, and they will buy like, it sounds like they'll buy like crazy with NAFTA. You paint a picture of a bonanza for American manufacturers of consumer goods. My question to you is, what are the administration's figures on the average income for a Mexican family? My figures that I've read, it's about $2,500 a family, and their discretionary income is about $100 a family. And also, what are the administration's figures on how much the wages have gone, where the wages have gone in the maquiladora area since our companies have been down there? My figures show that the wages have gone down by a third, and they've gone down by even more in relation to American wages. So my question to you, sir, is how much more are these Mexicans going to buy from us, and how are they going to do it with NAFTA?
Okay. The average Mexican purchases more per capita, per person, from the United States than the average Japanese or the average German. The average Mexican, when he purchases something internationally, buys 70 to 85% of his goods. And I'm talking about everything from tacos to tractors to automobiles from the United States. We believe this will increase with NAFTA. You criticize the Maquiladora program. I am with you. I think this is a program that has failed. It has created the possibility for American firms to move to Mexico for a variety of reasons. Our goal is by reducing tariffs, absolutely. We create the possibility for large firms and small firms to sell things to Mexico without a tax added at the border. So we believe fervently, remember, the Mexican middle class is one of the most vibrant and growing middle classes of anywhere in the world. They prefer American products.
But how much money do they have? How much money do they have to spend? How much dollars and cents do they have to spend to buy our products? They might buy ours more than other countries, but they don't have the money to buy them, nor will they after NAFTA.
Do you want to?
Yes. Could I point out, firstly, that the Mexicans buy more from the United States than Americans buy from Mexico, right? So the United States currently has a trade surplus with Mexico. Last year, $5.4 billion. So that this notion that somehow they're too poor to buy from us, the fact is we may be wealthy, but we aren't buying from them. Secondly, it's a misconception to think of only consumer goods. As Mexico develops, in fact, if you look at the profile of our exports to Mexico, about 40% roughly are capital goods. Indeed, Americans don't sell consumer goods around the world in general. Our forte is machinery and equipment. And as Mexico, a developing country, moves through the phases of building its infrastructure and investing in its factories and plants, that's exactly what the kind of goods they're going to buy. And what the NAFTA does is to give our manufacturers of those products a leg up over their international competition.
Ron?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize some realities here. General Motors is the largest private employer in Mexico. Since 1986, U.S. multinational corporations have created more jobs in Mexico than all employers have created in the United States. And we have to distinguish between the market in Mexico, between the Mexicans that you're talking about, and you're accurate as far as I know, and the consumer, and the average that Kurt is talking about. Because in that average are all the machine tools that are being sold to the U.S. corporations that are setting up factories along the maquiladora border and other places. And these don't count as consumption goods. Now, what we do see, because of the expenditure of capital goods in Mexico, is an enormous increase in the productivity of Mexican labor. They're very, very productive. On the other hand, their wages are going nowhere. Wages in the maquiladora system are lower than average wages in Mexico, and I am told by the Bureau of Labor Statistics are falling relative to wages in the United States, And when we interview our employers that are operating in the maquiladoras, they don't know what they're paying their workers, and they don't know what those wages buy. But when we have looked at it, it takes hours to earn enough money to buy a quart of milk. You simply can't buy many cars if you're an average Mexican. And that's the reason why we insisted there needed to be some enforceable worker rights in this, so there could be an independent labor movement that could fight for the interests of these workers to raise those wages so that those workers would be able to buy more goods, more Mexican goods and more goods from the United States. We don't have any problem with jobs going there. We just don't want them to go there to exploit oppressed people. If they're earning their fair share of their national income, there will be a bigger market, and I would assume that everybody on this panel that cares as much about trade as they seem to would welcome that.
Tim?
Right, sorry, just to underscore that, the averages are interesting, but not crucial. What you've got to look at is where the average is derived. And if in fact the average is derived by an increased skewing in the Mexican economy between more poorly paid workers and richer upper classes, the consumption patterns that you're going to engender from that are what really make ecologists nervous. In part, Al Gore tried to sell us the Accord last night on the notion that Mexico was going to buy so many more cars. I don't know of anyone who thinks that more cars are a solution to Mexico City's pollution problem. In another vein, he was trying to tell us that Walmart, the biggest store in the world, had just been opened up in Mexico, and we're going to have even more of those. Once again, I know of very few people who would defend the notion of retailing through Walmart as a means of environmental conservation.
Kurt?
Yeah, I want to point out, though, a schism in the alliance against NAFTA on this issue. Some want to sell autos to Mexico, others are against it. And so while they might be united against NAFTA, their actual goals about what they want to see ultimately are different. Mexico has very restrictive laws on automobiles, and essentially, if an American auto manufacturer wants to sell a car in Mexico, they have to export too. Now that's just insane, that's crazy. That's why this year we only sold 1,000 automobiles to Mexico. Now, independent studies plus studies of the big three suggest that if we are able to remove these restrictive laws in Mexico, which we are designed to do in NAFTA, the first year alone, we're going to sell 60,000 automobiles in Mexico. Now, there are some that are going to support this for economic reasons, and there are some that might be against it environmentally. But let's be clear, that's what will develop if NAFTA is passed.
Yes, sir.
Yes, as co-chair for the Coalition for Diversity here at Harvard, I'd like to also second the opinion that has been expressed on the lack of diversity on the panel. I hope we can do better next time. But I also have a question. Mr. Blackwell, I think the issue has been brought up, but I don't think you've addressed it directly yet, with regard to the fact that I think there is a direct and positive correlation between economic growth and prosperity and political opening and respect for human rights. Thus, I see NAFTA as actually a positive step in that area. But then, to Professor Lawrence, if you were in the Mexican ministry, given the fact that many nations have done a lot better, including Argentina, Mexico, Chile, by unilaterally decreasing their tariffs, and given the fact that through NAFTA there will be some infringement on national sovereignty through the committees that actually have power to sanction based on their opinions on the perspective of compliance to trade practices and different environmentalist issues, why would you advocate in getting into such an agreement?
As to your correlation between growth and these other things, I don't think it's as clear as you're admitting or in any way necessarily related. I mean, for example, and here I would take issue with Kurt. President Salinas is a revolutionary, and he's a liberalizer. He is by no means a Democrat. It's questionable whether he won the election for the office that he holds. Over 400 people, 400 activists of parties in the opposition have died since he was elected. This is not a democratic society, and I don't see how growth is going to produce that. You might look at some of the more successful growing economies. Singapore, would you consider that a free society? Taiwan, Is that a free society?
The majority.
These are the most rapidly growing economies in the world. They simply don't go together. It's arguable that they can go together, obviously.
And look at
but
the
they don't
histories of
necessarily go
Argentina,
together.
of Chile in the past. I think those are very good examples of countries that have.
Yeah, Chile's growing very
improved
fast
tremendously.
through democracy.
I think it's a good example.
I think your question is a very good one. Why would, after all, the tariff rates for Mexico are pretty low with respect to the U.S. market. Mexico absolutely, as you point out, has the ability to unilaterally lower its tariffs. So why get involved in this thing with the United States? My view is that sitting in the Mexican ministry, as you've asked me to be sitting, the answer is credibility and permanence. You see, Mexico's history was one of switching policies, and indeed, it was one of the most protectionist countries in the world, and was particularly unfriendly both to foreign investors and indeed to capitalists within Mexico. Recall the nationalization of the banks, a seminal episode in 1982. The result was that when President Salinas reversed the policies in Mexico, or continued more accurately with the reversal of the policies in Mexico, he went to Japan, he went to Europe, and he said, "I've changed." And he was simply met with some quizzical expressions. Nobody believed him, you see, because of the history. So he had a problem of credibility. He also had a problem of permanence, because next year, President Salinas will no longer be president of Mexico. The question is, what will his successors do? Now, maybe they will pursue the policies he has followed, or maybe they will not. How can he bind their hands to make sure that they think twice before they reverse what he has done? Well, the NAFTA accomplishes both of those tasks for him. Firstly, it advertised to the world that the changes had occurred. By the way, people talk about Mexico had joined the GATT. Mexico had said unilaterally, we've liberalized. But nobody believes the GATT is a particularly efficient enforcer. When you sign an agreement with the United States, nobody doubts the powers of the lawyers of Washington. And in particular, so what Mexico has done then is to bind its hands. Now, it's something for Mexicans to appraise. Is it worth it or is it not? Indeed, Mexico is importing new institutions on a wholesale basis into the country as they reform. We heard mention of intellectual property rights just earlier on. All of these can be accomplished within a secure and stable framework, which is the NAFTA. And I think that's really what it's all about.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Carlo Pauletti. I'm Nieman Fellow. I have to point out some facts that I was reading today. In 1990, and I want to broaden a little more NAFTA, not just to Mexico, but as you mentioned, Mr. Campbell, to Latin America as a whole. 1990, U.S. export to Latin America as a whole were $53 billion. 1991, $63 billion. 1992, $75 billion. 1993 is going to be $90 billion. If I were American, believe me, I would be strongly supportive of NAFTA because you have surplus with us. We have 4-time labor surplus with us for the kind of your product you export to our countries and you export to you. And it's the only one region you have surplus and you have 20% a year of increase in this market. It's your biggest partner in the world today. My question for Mr. Campbell is, if is it too good for America to benefit, why we in Latin America should support NAFTA?
Repeat your question again.
If it's so great for American,
If it is to benefit for the United States, why we in Latin America should support NAFTA?
I see. About 2 weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal, which I would point out is no great friend of the Clinton administration, wrote an editorial about NAFTA, beginning to praise President Clinton for getting out in front and making the pitch about why NAFTA makes sense. And it made the point very powerfully that this agreement is a repudiation of zero-sum negotiating strategy and zero-sum agreements, that this is a win-win for both countries. The article went on to say and a win-win for the hemisphere. It's a big win for us. It's a littler win for Mexico and perhaps for the rest of Latin America, but it's certainly a big win for us. The Wall Street Journal also made the point that American negotiators, in their view, had done a bad job in arms control negotiations with the Soviets, had done a bad job in trade deals with Japan, hadn't done a very good job in discussions with China, hadn't done too good a job with the GATT, hadn't done very well with the European community, but had done a very good job, with the NAFTA. I hope that our country and our House of Representatives has the wisdom to know a good deal when they see it and vote yes next Wednesday.
I would just like to add that if you look at the variety of studies, in fact, the benefits to Mexico and other U.S. trading partners are larger than to the United States. The simple reason, the basic reason for that is scale economies. The United States is already a very large economy, and our producers are functioning at global efficiency levels because of their scale. In many cases in Latin American countries, those scale economies have not been reaped because of constrained and protected markets. And so it is quite possible for us both to gain. Indeed, I tried to argue earlier that the gains for the United States are actually smaller in terms of the effect on living standards than the gains for Mexico and other trading partners who will enter into such an agreement. It is a win-win agreement.
We can only cover a couple more questions, so if you could please keep them very brief. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alex Mathis, and I have two questions, one for Mr. Berlin and one for Mr. Campbell. Quickly, Mr. Berlin, even accepting that an increase in trade in Mexico will help them to offset environmental problems, to increase environmental technologies and what have you. I'm worried about natural resources, and can you please answer how we will protect our natural resources? I'm concerned the increased investment will actually deplete those resources before they get to the $5,000 level or whatever level it is to protect those natural resources. My second quick question to Mr. Campbell is, who is going to be paying for this $8 billion border cleanup? And I'm asking the question. I don't know for sure, but I hope it's not us, because it should be multinational corporations.
On the first question, the agreement does set up a conservation fund to be used in Mexico, not particularly large. I think it's about $20 million to begin with to deal with natural resource impacts on Mexico. It was pushed very heavily by the U.S. environmental groups that are involved in Mexico on the natural resource level, the World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International. All those U.S. groups very strongly support NAFTA. In addition to that, the Commission is tasked with the responsibility of looking into natural resource issues, of looking into endangered species issues and wildlife issues, and I think it's going to be a priority of the U.S. to do that. Finally, you've got to compare that again to the status quo. The natural resource status quo in Mexico is unacceptable. Something's got to be done to break that cycle. It's going to be very hard even with this agreement, but I think this agreement gives you an opportunity that doesn't exist without it.
Let me answer your question about environmental cost, and again, try to point out a contradiction here. You'll hear from opponents of NAFTA that it's going to cost so much money to pay for this. It's just too much. We can't afford it. And then someone else will say, look how terrible it is. It's horrible. We're going to need to spend a lot of money on this. And there's a contradiction there. Most of the money that will be directed towards the cleanup of the northern border area that we heard earlier about will come from multilateral sources. And so when you hear a number like $8 billion, remember this is highly leveraged money. For the next 5 years, the actual American input into the money for the NAD Bank, which will be associated with border cleanup, with the World Bank, and remember, we've already put money into the World Bank, and 3 weeks ago, the World Bank announced almost a $3 billion program to clean up the environment in northern Mexico. It's the single largest grant for environmental cleanup in the history of the World Bank. Now that's money that we put in long ago that we have no budget hit on.
Okay, that may be true, but
The taxpayers' money.
our taxpayers paid that money.
The polluter does not pay, in other words.
For the last year, 5 years ago, we paid that money.
Mexico is putting in the lion's share of binational bilateral money. That's very clear. For the first 5 years, we're putting in about $250, maybe $300 million, which we are going to leverage 10 times in loans to Mexico and to our own border area. This is a good deal for us. This is a great deal. we're able to leverage it, and we hope and we expect that Mexico will pay this back.
Thank you for your response. I would appreciate if somebody else could respond to that same, if there is a good.
I just want to point out here that the polluter is not paying here.
Yeah.
In other words, the cleaning up the border, which in large part is the result of the operations of these corporations. These corporations are not being asked to clean up the border.
Let me cut it off if I may, because we've got to close out, and I want to get 2 last questions, and these people have been very patient waiting. You, sir, and then this one.
Thank you.
over here.
My name is Victor. I'm here visiting a friend at school. One comment for Mr. Berlin and one comment for Mr. Campbell. Mr. Berlin, it has to do with your talk this evening about the status quo and how you worked with 6 of the other environmental groups about changing the status quo. And I read your 35-page memo that did a very good job towards changing that. But
Probably the only person who's read it.
But where I think you've tragically misdefined what the status quo is in looking at you're saying that the status quo is the ecological situation in Mexico right now. When we all know that what the status quo is, and anybody who has the slightest ecological awareness could tell you this, is an economic model based in the intensive exploitation of natural resources and unbridled growth. That is the root of the ecological crisis. And how NAFTA goes towards changing that, I don't know. I was in Rio last June when all the presidents got together and said we need to change our patterns of consumption and reduce and things like this. I don't see how NAFTA or any kind of side agreement can go towards changing that. My question towards Mr. Campbell has to do with, again, this new status quo that we've established, and if that does represent current U.S. policy on trade and the environment, are we to expect that that status quo will be taken to the Uruguay round and implemented in parallel commitments?
Let me start with the first question. I mean, you're right. NAFTA does not address the issue that you're talking about, nor do the side agreements address that. I mean, to a certain extent, you have to make a choice on this, and the anti-environmental groups have really made a choice, some of them at least, and said, we want to deal with these basic patterns of consumption. That's what we want the North American Free Trade Agreement to do that. It doesn't do it successfully. The groups that are supporting it have basically looked at NAFTA and said, economic development is going to take place with or without NAFTA. We want to put in place a series of measures that will ensure that that economic development doesn't cause the kind of problems you're talking about. I mean, the U.S. environment...
And again, that's where you make the fatal flaw. You don't define the status quo as that model of economic development.
Well,
and that's where...
Well, I don't think it's a I don't think it's a fatal flaw, but I don't define it. I do define it. I don't say that you're going away from that model of economic development. You're absolutely correct about that. All the environmental groups that are backing that
all accept this model of development.
Have accepted this model of development.
Which we agree is leading us to ecological collapse.
No, I don't agree it's leading us to ecological disaster.
Where is it working?
The United States, for example.
You seen our forests?
That's another debate. We got a whole other.
Well, we have another debate.
Excuse me, Mr. Campbell, please.
States,
There's a question.
If you look at the United States, for example, and again, I'm not saying there aren't a million things we can do better. That's not the point. But if you look at the United States, for example, take species and natural resources. We're not going to lose any endangered species of birds or mammals in the United States in any likelihood.
Unless we recall the Endangered Species Act.
Last week.
Which one?
In California, because of the fires.
Well, we didn't lose any we didn't lose any species of birds, that's for sure.
Mr. Campbell, please.
Yeah, but anyway, let me just finish. Whereas in Mexico, which has a very, very highly endemic fauna, you're talking about total catastrophe as far as that goes. And you're talking about that throughout Latin America. You're talking about extinction rates of 1 million species in the next 25 years.
And you're claiming we can do no better than this.
1 million species you're talking about in that period of time. I think you can do better than Mexico is doing. This model is much, much better than Mexico is doing. Maybe there's an alternative model. If you want to push that model, go ahead.
And how will new orange plantations in Chiapas do for biological diversity preservation in Mexico?
I'm sorry. We've got
I'd like Mr. Campbell's answer to the GATT negotiations.
The GATT negotiations do not concern environmental issues.
That's what Bush said about a year ago, that
That's
NAFTA doesn't concern the environment.
No, I was talking about GATT. Just a reflection on the point about the environment in Latin America. One of the things.
No, I want to. It's a very specific question about.
I know what you want to do, but I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do.
Ask a question and get an answer. So we want you to do the same thing.
The interesting thing, and a thing that we're struck by as we're going to go forward, and one of the challenges that we're going to have to deal with in our relationships with Latin America is, frankly, many of the governments and peoples of Latin America are concerned by what they perceive to be environmental imperialism. I've been struck, frankly, in our discussions with the Brazilians at their concern about our concern over their environment. And so one of the things that, as we go about defining how we relate with our environment, we're going to find how difficult it is for us to impose some of our views, some of our values on peoples that have different conceptions about how to proceed. And it's a challenge that, frankly, is going to be for all of us across political and the labor and environmental barriers. I told you, GATT does not include environment.
Last question. Over here, the last question. We've got to wrap it up.
My concerns the need to establish an international forum to address environmental problems. I don't see that any such thing exists at the current time between the United States and Mexico. However, NAFTA does create the possibility for change to happen, which I don't think that anybody would argue that probably won't happen immediately without NAFTA. I would challenge anybody to try to get individual bills against individual corporations doing individually bad things in Mexico through a PAC-controlled Congress, as opposed to trying to individuals bringing issues to a forum created by NAFTA. I don't see how creating a forum to deal with international issues, to deal with economic externalities that are not even taken into account by GATT right now, could make the environment worse. I guess I addressed that to probably Mr. Berlin or whoever wants to talk about it.
On the broader question of what happens after NAFTA, one of the major issues the environmental community is looking at now is what are we going to do in the world community now as a follow-up on that. And people are beginning to write about and talk about should there be a general agreement on the environment that's parallel to the general agreement on tariffs and trade. Should the next round of GATT negotiations, it's certainly probably too late, and I think that's a shame to do anything in this round about the environment, but should the next round of GATT negotiations reflect issues like the ones we're talking about here. I'm heading a panel at the American Society of International Law next April, where that's going to be the major focus. There's an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs about that by a fellow named Dan Esty, who's been in EPA. This is an issue that's coming up. These international environmental issues in this context are really very new. They've really only arisen in the last 3 or 4 years that anybody, at least in the environmental community, has paid serious attention to them. And I think their time is coming very, very rapidly, no matter what happens in this current round of GATT negotiations.
Thank you all very much. I want to thank our panelists, and thank you all for coming.